Well, what a pleasure it is to be here in Sydney tonight and be here at the Center for Climate, at the facilitation of the Center for Climate Justice Research. There is, of course, no more central issue to our time. So what I want to do tonight is to ask us to think very seriously about capitalism in the web of life, not capitalism and nature, but capitalism in the climate and the climate in capitalism. How does capital work? How does capitalism work historically? What is work and who is the worker? And how does this all help us deal with the analytics of climate crisis in the 21st century, but also hopefully the politics of it? So how do we go about conceptualizing what Earth system scientists call planetary state shifts, and that is abrupt, irreversible planetary shifts in the conditions of life on this planet, fundamental shifts in the conditions of life. Of course, we are living through the end of the Holocene, marking 12,000 years of what climate scientists describe as unusual climate stability. How do we chart the ways that that plays into capital accumulation crisis, and vice versa? How do we see capital in nature, nature in capital? And how do we do so in a way that avoids the masculinist and economistic readings of capitalism? How do we see the processes of climate and world accumulation as irreducibly grounded in the dynamics of empire and class and mobilized through axes of racialized and gendered violence? That is, how do we understand modernity's tendency towards planetary crisis and accumulation crisis as two moments of a self-forming whole? How can we understand this dialectically and not merely as a series of unfortunate interactions? Well, crucial to my thinking has been something called world ecology, and I will try to unpack that over the next 40 minutes or so. So this is, at base, a way of thinking about capitalism and the web of life as fundamentally internal to each other at every point. It's not literally that there isn't an outside, of course there is, but we need to understand the historic asymmetries and the uneven geographies of capitalism as capitalism produces nature, but that nature as a whole also produces capitalism. This means, notwithstanding repeated pronouncements from the 17th century to the present from folks like Bacon and Descartes onwards, this means that modernity never masters or dominates or possesses nature. But that is, for sure, the fantasy of capital. This is the mirage of technological solutions to the present impasse. In fact, it is profoundly ahistorical and ungeographical at its core to think that technology will fix something that it has not, under capitalist relations of power, nature, and capital, done for the past 5 centuries. So to be clear, capital, of course, never subsumes nature, at least in the unidimensional sense of that term, suggested both by Marxists, but also by the ecological footprint, perhaps the most, alongside the Anthropocene, the most popular environmentalist concept of our times. And that capital itself, as a set of economic processes, indeed has very few effective mechanisms for managing specifically capitalist natures in any given era. Now, that's important to recognize for a number of reasons, but one is because the neoliberal craze for turning over global natures to market-oriented management represents a historic rupture, and I would suggest an exhaustion of capitalism's ways of organizing nature. It's a rupture with long-standing patterns of state and imperial governance of nature as a set of conditions of production, what I've called cheap nature, necessary to revive and sustain great waves of capital accumulation. So central to this argument is that nature is never simply just there. It must be produced and refashioned and reinvented, both symbolically and materially at every point, and those are, as I'll try to show, processes of profound violence that go well beyond the economic form. Now, this process of cheap nature has a lot to do with a pathology of capital as it seeks profitable investment opportunities in a world in which there are today no significant frontiers of cheap nature. And at a time, thanks to climate change, when the very mechanisms of cheapening labor, food, energy, and raw materials, what I have called the four cheaps, are not only breaking down, but reversing themselves. Climate change represents not merely the end of the road of cheap nature, but the implosion of the cheap nature model that has governed humans and the rest of nature for the past 5 centuries. This is most evident at the moment of the relation between climate change and agriculture, where the enclosure of the atmospheric commons is now complete and now suppressing yield growth in the world's big 4 cereal crops, and we'll return to that later. The question of food is absolutely central to labor because there is no more fundamental relation of work and capital and the web of life in the history of capitalism than the relationship between food and labor. That is the nexus from which everything unfolds. That is the nexus which allows us to be here in this room. So now what I want to do is to take a quick look at a few contrasting representations of today's crises of planetary life on the one hand and accumulation crisis or world accumulation on the other. Most of these will be fairly familiar to you, and what I want to ask us to do is to reflect upon the modes of representation and the ways in which these different representations are kept very much separate. That we have not just a crisis of our politics around climate change, but we have a crisis of our imagination that is a political imaginary in many respects inherited from a long history of modern dualism, that is, ontological separateness of humans from the rest of nature. As we shall see, these are not innocent concepts of nature and society. So we have a question of representation. Who would have thought? Representation matters, that we have to be very serious about. So here we have the one representation of planetary crisis and of the state shift. Note, of course, the neo-Malthusian assumption. It all comes back to too many people. And of course, when people say too many people, they mean too many brown people. And that's a legacy that goes back to Malthus, who of course occupied the first chair in political economy at the East India Company College at the end of the 18th century. Don't worry, we'll have opportunity to return to Malthus later. So we have, again, these familiar hockey stick charts. So what happens if we start to imagine a form of representation that includes things like the secular decline in the world rate of profit, or the ongoing stagnation in labor productivity growth since the 1970s, identified not only by Marxist accounts, but also by very mainstream people like Professor Gordon at Northwestern University. What happens if we chart these J-sticks and map them alongside and through and within the rising volume of surplus capital, that is, capital looking for new forms of investment? Well, in the environmentalist imaginary that we have all inherited, and this isn't a bad thing, but it is a model that gives us nature plus society. This is what I call green arithmetic. And it's not bad. It's just outlived its usefulness, because in short, nature plus society, nature plus economy do not add up. All right, so we have 3 big questions in reflecting upon the conjuncture today, and this is very helpfully posed by what I've called the popular Anthropocene, to which we'll return in a moment. These 3 big questions are namely this: when and where did all this begin? How did we get here? And who is we anyway? Who is this anthropos? And how we answer these questions shapes our diagnosis of the problem, but of course, our diagnosis of the problem also shapes, yes, our politics. So for those of you who are familiar with my work, you'll know, yes, I'm going to talk about the Anthropocene a little bit. First, I want to clear up a misconception. There are, in fact, 2, and indeed more than just 2, Anthropocenes. One is a geological Anthropocene. This is the discussion over stratigraphic signals in the geological record. That's an awesome Anthropocene that's very interesting. Contrary to what some people seem to think, I'm quite fascinated by this research, and indeed I cite these scholars quite often in my own work, and so do my colleagues in the World Ecology conversation. But this is a debate over stratigraphy. Now, that's not usually what we mean when we talk about the Anthropocene, the age of humans. What we usually talk about is associated with the popular Anthropocene. Here is this debate over the relations that initiated the drive towards planetary crisis, our state shift, and how to understand that crisis. Now, that's a problem for a lot of reasons that I'll try to unpack. But the alternative to the Anthropocene, age of humans, well, humans did it in the way that kids will be kids and snakes will be snakes and alligators will be alligators. That it's just humans did it. Humans do terrible things to nature, and that's the source of the problem. This is, of course, a very old neo-Malthusian perspective, Malthusian and then neo-Malthusian. You know, when did it all begin, Paul Ehrlich asks in 1968 in The Population Bomb. He says, well, it all began billions and billions of years ago. That's the time frame that we need to understand the crisis today. Well, is it? The alternative, of course, is not the Anthropocene, but the Capitalocene, the age of capital. And it's at this point somebody says, aha, we have you. That the Capitalocene, that's just another sort of Marxist, economic reductionist kind of argument. No, not at all. In fact, the Capitalocene says two things. One, it says that capitalism is not an economic system. It's not even a social system in itself. It is a way of organizing power and nature and capital as fundamental to each other. It is a way of showing how much of what goes on under the rubric of capitalism in the web of life is in fact politically enforced by cultures of domination, by states and by empires. Capitalocene also does a second thing, which is to say that this category we have of anthropogenic, the anthropogenic climate change, it says that that's actually quite mistaken. It's not humans doing it, it is some humans, it is the 1%. And then people say, well, now you're blaming the capitalists, you're blaming the 1%, which is actually not what the argument of the Capitalocene is. It says that the relations of power and capital and nature that have come to dominate the world over the past 5 centuries are now driving fundamental state shifts at all ecological scales. And by the way, the 1% are completely to blame. So let's be clear about that. But that's not what the Capitalocene argues. All right, so so instead of anthropogenic, we need to remember that climate change is, instead of anthropogenic, it is capitalogenic. And it asks questions about what are the specific processes that have brought the planet, including the human beings on this planet, to such a precarious period in human history, in planetary history. So the usual narrative of when did this all begin, and this is very much incarnated in the popular Anthropocene. It asks, well, when did it all begin? Well, we know, don't we? It all began with the steam engine and with coal in England around 1800, and that's what's really driving the whole process. Well, as I'll try to show, that's a problem. Not because what we usually think of as the Industrial Revolution wasn't a turning point. Of course it was a turning point, but because the technologies, not just of machines, but of power, of race, of gender, of colonialism, were formed centuries earlier. And so if our concern is to understand that the planetary crisis, the planetary state shifts are not just about economics, but they are also about how capitalism works as an extraordinary system, an extraordinarily violent system of colonial, racialized and gendered rule, class rule at every turn, then we need to go deeper into history. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, 1492 never ended. We still live in the era inaugurated, or if you are an indigenous person, detonated in 1492. Then we need to understand that 1492 never ended. Indeed, that this was a story not merely of ferocious killing and slaving and raping and seizure of basic wealth. It was also, because after a certain point you can only plunder so much. You can only rob a bank so many times in one day. You have to figure out how to rationalize the world in order to sustain profit and accumulation for the 1%. So we have to understand this is a picture of double entry bookkeeping. which, by the way, was used not only in the ledgers of, say, the Genoese, who bankrolled the slaving and colonial ethnic cleansing conquests of the Iberians, but was also adopted by the Spanish as they were installing their fantastically violent and creative and dynamic silver mining regime in the colonial Andes. A double entry bookkeeping is used to ensure not just economic process, but the fiscal rationality of colonial domination. That one of the things that strikes me about the long history of socialist and Marxist thought is that there is a profound love for the big machine. We don't see double entry bookkeeping and the modern map as fundamental to the world we inhabit. We see things like the steam engine, like it's a big piece of machinery, right? But in fact, this map, which was the earliest surviving map of its kind from the Portuguese archives, this is a map that is an instrument of global conquest, of global domination. This is a map which survives from 1502, that is right on the eve of the Portuguese invasion and seizure of the vital trade routes of the Indian Ocean. Mapping, of course, remains central, as we know. We know this from GPS and remote sensing and all the rest, that capitalism rules nature not just through economic motives, not just through brute force and cultures of domination, but also through this European rationality of world domination. So, in order to start to make sense of this, I think that we need to destabilize the sacred category of environmentalist thought and analysis, which is ultimately consumption, as its consumption and population. We need another meta-category, and not a reductive one, but a one open enough, subtle enough, flexible enough. And I think that that's work. It has to be work in an expansive way. In my Web of Life, I use the concept of work energy to try to dissolve the human exemptionalism inscribed in how we usually think of work, that in fact many different forms of life produce work or potentially useful work that can be appropriated and mobilized for capital accumulation. So in green thought, there's a basic question, which is this. And it's a good question. I'm going to pick on the environmentalists a little bit, but it's a good question. What does capitalism do to nature? But what happens if we turn that inside out? What happens if we ask, how does capitalism put nature to work? Then we start to get a different sense. Capitalism, of course, works not because it does terrible things to nature. It does. But because it is successful at mobilizing and appropriating manifold natures, including human natures, and mobilizing these for useful work for capital accumulation for free or low cost. Because, contrary to what we are often taught about capitalism, capitalism is the least efficient civilization ever devised, the most expensive civilization ever devised. Why do you think the capitalists are always trying to go someplace new? Now Elon Musk wants to go to Mars. I say, let him go. Let's do that. All right, but I'm also now going to pick on the Marxist thought. So what's central to Marxist thought? If you ask them, well, what is capitalism about? And you probably get some answer, yes, maybe about endless accumulation, but about the generalization of the cash nexus of commodity production and exchange. And that's not wrong, but it's partial. And here, this is just my very simple illustration. This is the typical Marxist model. So you have the cash nexus at one point in time. You can pick this 1800, 1600, 1500, doesn't matter. And it grows and it grows and it grows and it grows. Nature gets capitalized. Nature gets subsumed, whatever it is. This is the typical model. It sort of overwhelms everything, right? So this is, of course, partial because capitalism thrives and is premised on a fundamental asymmetry, not only between town and country, not only between bourgeois and proletarian, but between the zone of valorized work, of capitalized work, paid work, and the much larger, necessarily much larger zones of the unpaid work of human and extra-human natures. That is on the work of, in Maria Misa's wonderful turn of phrase, women, nature, and colonies. Indeed, so important is this that whenever capitalism comes close to expanding the zone of paid work to a larger domain relative to its zones of unpaid human and extra-human work, it falls into crisis historically. So this means we need a different metaphor for understanding the history of capitalism in the web of life. And central to that is the idea that capitalism booms when islands of commodification and monetization can draw upon oceans of potentially cheap nature. That is, oceans of cheap nature in the form in successive eras of African slaves, of Persian Gulf oil, of English coal fields, of Baltic timber, Mississippi cotton, and on and on and on. So here is a different way of looking at it. The red is the cash nexus. That is the circuit of capital. That's what we read about in Capital. But Marx is so good in this volume that in the heart of the book at successive points, he is always drawing our attention to the necessity for frontiers, nowhere more clearly than in his discussion of the working day. It's here where he talks about capitalism as a system of turning children's blood into capital. I don't think that's just a polemic. I think that that is a serious analytical metaphor. All right, so if 1492 is not over, what was it about 1492 that did it? Now, the usual account, whether it's Marxist or otherwise, is to say, well, this was mercantile capitalism, and it was exchanging, and it was about trade. It wasn't real. It wasn't real capitalism. And I want to say that's not at all correct. In fact, the audacious invention of early capitalism that is very much still with us is to invent nature with the uppercase N as something external to civilization, to the central mechanisms of power and capital. And this was an audacious act because we see here the God trick of the modern map, not yet the Mercator projection. That would come in another 67 years or so. But this was an audacious act of putting the potential work of two continents at the disposal of European empires. Now, as we know from the work of Maslin and Lewis, the mass extermination of indigenous populations contributed to forest growback and then to falling CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, which then was involved in the mid-17th century Ice Age. I mean, some of the worst eras of the Ice Age. And that had a particular consequence, which was the kind of climate forcing of European power all around the world. So when the little Ice Age hits, it doesn't have the same impact that it did in the 14th century on medieval Europe. It has a very different impact. It forces out European empires and capitals even more intensively than it did before, which had the effect of creating this planetary model of cheap nature. So the usual way from the environmentalist critique that we think about capitalism is what they call the vampire model of capitalism. That capitalism comes into planet Earth. It's like a alien species on Independence Day or some other B science fiction movie, and so it's going to suck the Earth dry of all its resources. And yeah, look, there's some truth to that. But I think one of the things that climate change tells us today is that the great fear of 1970s environmentalism, that we were going to deplete the global economy of its vital resources, that's really been outweighed by the problem not of the taps but of the sinks. So the sinks are now overflowing, and they are the consequences of climate change are already manifesting themselves in powerful ways, reinforcing labor productivity stagnation, suppressing yield growth, and doing other far more serious things to all of the wonderful creatures that are in our biosphere. So we have to keep this in mind, that this frontier process that begins with the conquest of the Americas and the creation of nature with this uppercase N as external nature is very much rooted in the climate crisis today. It is always, where do we find some place to work and reproduce capitalism not just bigger and badder and uglier, but more and more cheaply. And so, of course, every great economic frontier is also a waste frontier, and the waste that capitalism produces over time becomes more and more deadly, more and more toxic. We could draw blood, that would be very gruesome to do at a talk like this, but we could draw blood and test it, and we would see heavy metals and all sorts of endocrine disruptors and everything else in our blood, that our bodies as well as the climate have been turned into toxic waste dumps for global capital. All right, so one of the things that's been missed because of both mainstream and radical views of capitalism in this period of the centuries after 1492 is that they all miss something really, really, really important. And there are a bunch of different elements to this, but one is that's fundamental is this radical shift in environment making of a kind, of a scale, of a scope, of a speed that outstripped anything seen since the dawn of agriculture 12,000 years before. And that's important to keep in mind. We need to keep that in mind, and I'm going to give you a few stories about this. Because what we need to keep in mind is the way that capital accumulation and the pursuit of profit and the reproduction of an ever-expanding mass of wealth that exists only for the sake of growing more wealth that's not only a nonlinear dynamic in its own way, so that's a nonlinear dynamic, but it requires another nonlinear dynamic, which is to draw more and more and more of uncommodified natures, including human natures, out of their homes and their habitats and into the vortex of accumulation in an asymmetrical way. So there's one asymmetry that you always have to produce more under capitalism to profit more, to accumulate more, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then there is, you always have to, for every act of exploiting labor power of a worker in a factory or an office, you have to find a disproportionately greater amount of what I would call the unpaid work energy of the rest of nature in order to keep that system cheap and profitable. I mean, if you think about it for a moment, every industrial revolution is basically premised on what? The average worker hour in the Manchester textile mills or in Detroit's River Rouge auto plants in the 1930s was premised on more and more material throughput per average hour of work. And in order for that system to remain profitable, and Marx talks about this in volume 3 of Capital. If you're really a Marx geek, you can go there and look. You know, he says, look, the industrial dynamism of capitalism is so great that it tends to outrun the capacity of resource or sectors to supply raw materials cheaply. And that's what he calls a general law, in his words, of underproduction. It's very important. So what was happening in this era of Columbus in these 2 centuries after? So one of the things that people often reflect upon is they say, oh, well, what about Easter Island? And what about the Chinese? They cut down their forests. In medieval Europe, they cut down their forests. Yeah, they did. But it took them centuries compared to decades or just years. In medieval Picardy in northeastern France, it took 2 centuries to clear 12,000 hectares of forest in the 12th and 13th centuries. 400 years later, in northeastern Brazil, at the height of the sugar boom in the 1650s, 12,000 hectares of forest were cleared in 1 year. So that is a 2 order of magnitude shift. That is colossal. That's powerful. So we're going to keep this in mind, and we're going to return back to this in a few minutes. Now, the other point that I want to introduce here is that these everyday words, nature, society, are not innocent. They are not merely words that we use. They are concepts that have guided historically the movements of colonial occupations, invasions, and the policing and disciplining of many, many human beings, including colonial populations and women within the metropolitan zones of early capitalism. So this is the emergence of a world that is premised on a fundamental binary code of nature versus society, man and woman, colony and metropole, on and on and on. So we need to be able to identify this moment at which nature and society become more than just words. Indeed, they assume their modern meaning only in the century after 1550 in the English language. And there's an interesting set of parallels to tell in other Romance languages as well. So we need to ask, well, why do we see the words nature, society, and European emerging in this century after 1550? Well, this is, as many of you will be familiar with, the era where the English agricultural revolution begins to take off. And it's true that the non-agricultural population in England begins growing about twice as fast as the agricultural population. So that's one moment. Another element that we often forget, we think fossil capital and we think coal and all the rest, that's a 17th century, 18th century phenomena. No, the coal revolution in England begins in the 1530s. By 1560, most of England's coal fields are being worked. What else is going on? Well, we see class and colonialism very clearly in this moment. One is the defeat of Kett's Rebellion, the high tide of agrarian resistance to capitalism in 1549. And then we see most strikingly the intensification of English colonial rule in Ireland after 1541. The English, and I'm sure you're all familiar with this, the English didn't think much of the Irish. Indeed, our term beyond the pale refers to the colonial line that separated the wild Irish, in the words of the Earl of Northampton, from the civilized English. And indeed, the English strategy in the 1550s and 60s was to essentially do what the Americans did in South Vietnam in the 1960s, is establish strategic hamlets, English-style towns. And the English weren't alone in doing this in Ireland. The Spanish do this in colonial Peru. The Dutch do this in Southeast Asia. This goes on and on and on. And at every step, you see the biopolitical state stepping in to organize not only the land, but the human conditions of cheap work. What else was going on in this period? Well, as Silvia Federici powerfully illustrates, we have an era in which that women are redefined, their work is redefined as non-work, that they are part of nature. This is wrapped up in a far-reaching set of scientific and territorial and economic processes, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. But here is one of the crucial dimensions of why this divide. Why is this Moore guy always talking about nature versus society and the dualism? You know, what's the big deal here? Well, the big deal is that in the era of primitive accumulation, we see not only people being pushed off the land, we see large numbers of most human beings, indeed, in the era of early capitalism, being expelled from humanity. They are being expelled from humanity. They are being relocated into the mythical zone of nature with the uppercase N, in order that they can be treated cheaply, in the double meaning of that word, both cheap in price, but also in the cultural sense, to cheapen, to treat with less respect. So this was not merely some cultural process out there in the ether. This was fundamental to the accumulation of capital. That's not where I want to be. I want to be here. That what we have here when we talk about the famous price revolution of this era, that we see that it is powerfully gendered, and that, as Federici reminds us, that the creation of a gendered binary was itself a lever of surplus value production that was essential to the accumulation of wealth. That the creation of man, woman, nature, society was the creation of a technology of power that was in itself a force of production, to use an older and somewhat quaint language. So these humans, indigenous peoples, Africans, women, became part of nature and were treated accordingly. And so this means that the racialized and gendered systems that flowed through class formation and the binary logic of nature society were fundamental to the world in which we live. Indeed, as I'm sure some of you are familiar with, in Australia, the Aborigines are categorized as part of the flora and fauna of this great continent until about a century ago. So this is a process of profound cultural and physical violence that deserves to be brought into the ways that we think about the modern economy. And so when someone like the great socialist feminist Nestor King describes the new gendered order of early capitalism as a system of human sacrifice, of dispossessing women of culture and treating the domain of women's activity as natural, the better that they could be treated cheaply. We are dealing with culture as a fundamental issue of the question of sustainability, of planetary life and well-being, and the accumulation of capital in all the conflicts. Of course, the idea of human sacrifice in capitalism is not merely a metaphor. This was the actual practice of capitalism in inflicting genocide on indigenous peoples everywhere, but also, of course, on African slaves. You have 2.2 million slave departures from Africa in the 2 centuries after 1500, with just 300,000 African slaves in the Americas by the end of that period. So this was not simply unpaid work, but it was also a moment of profound ecological transformation in a conventional sense of that term. So what does this mean for understanding our history of the present? Well, it means that if we look at this era of the rise of capitalism, it is very much still with us. Indeed, what we see in this era is the strange and peculiar mixtures of the great frontier, of great industrializations, of great rationalizations, and what Raj Patel and I call in A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things, the great domestication. Because, of course, the foundational political theory of liberalism from somebody like John Locke was to reckon nature, society, man, woman, slave, master, public and private as hierarchical, not just separate, but hierarchical domains. So we make light of that at our peril. And we make and it's also crucial because it's in this era that we see the question of population and what Marx called the special laws of population for every historical system coming into play. It's like technology, population gets sort of detached from its actually existing histories and geographies, and indeed the whole field of demography, with some rather spectacular and inspiring exceptions, but the whole field of demography has been famously gender blind amongst having other problems. But here's the basic gist of it, that before capitalism, commerce follows people. So settlers went out, as in medieval Europe, and then commerce followed. But with the rise of capitalism, we see something very different. Through all of these frontiers, that people begin to follow the commodities backed by empire. And that is nowhere more clear than in the history of the slave trade, where you have at every step the rapacious and geographically restless movement of what we today call industrial agriculture, which formed in the sugar plantations of first Madeira and Sao Tome, but then in northeastern Brazil, and famously in the Caribbean. Every time that sugar plantation frontier moved, so did the slaving frontier in Africa. That's central to understanding how the geographies of human nature and commodity production and producing food, for instance, so with agriculture being so central to our unfolding climate crisis, that we need to put these into play. And indeed, it's a rather sad story that the very heartlands of sugar and slavery in the Caribbean have been most recently those hardest hit by the climate change that is driven in great measure by industrial agriculture. And so this is extraordinary. This is what I call the social death surplus profit. This is, you can see the capitalist GDP moves very, very slowly and incrementally, but that massive, far more prodigious wastage of human nature in the form of slavery carried as ever on ships, just as today our global ecology and economy are carried forth on those monstrosities that we call container ships, themselves a creation of the American empire in the Cold War. So what we're looking at today is a dramatic amplification of this movement of conquest and appropriation, and of always searching for new forms of cheap nature to appropriate and exploit. And so this is fundamental when we begin to ask questions about technology and what technologies do. In fact, if you look at arguably the 3 greatest technologies of the modern world, that all centrally have to do with work in various ways. They are the cartographic and shipbuilding revolutions of the 16th and 17th centuries, the steam engine, of course, of the long 19th century, and then the internal combustion engine. All of those great epoch-making technologies worked because they were situated and mobilized within large-scale structures of territorial, imperial, and colonial power, of other technologies of power that essentially brought in the wealth, the unpaid work of nature as a whole to the apparatus of global capitalism. Indeed, none more spectacularly than the steam engine over the long 19th century. Steam is most important, of course, because it fuels the steamship and railroad revolutions, which were, as we know, at every point linked to gunboat diplomacy. Seems too kind a word, but to military power at every turn. So what we need to do when we begin to think about this era of climate change today is that we need to be very careful about this fall into a kind of technologism, into a kind of economism, into a kind of Anglo-centrism that has recently made such a return. Indeed, it is not even clear that the key machine of the Industrial Revolution is the steam engine. A equally strong and in some ways much stronger case can be made for the marriage of the technologies of slavery and the cotton gin, which is patented in the United States in 1793. No less an authority than Karl Marx said it is only the fall in the price of cotton that made possible the rise of large-scale industry. And to that we could add it was only the massive deployment of slave labor and the expulsion and extermination of indigenous peoples as constitutive of this moment. But it's not only that one of the things that we've learned is that it's also sugar and slavery provided the indispensable and critical increment of capital formation that made the Industrial Revolution go, that was derived from the West Indian plantations under British hegemony. So how do we start to bring this into the present in some more fundamental ways? Well, we need to go back to understanding that the problem of neoliberalism has been essentially, and we can come at this from many different angles, and I'm not trying to say this as the only possible interpretation, but we need to see it crucially in this light, that the neoliberal capital accumulation and capitalism and environmental governance, such as it has taken place in the era where the potential frontiers of cheap nature are smaller than ever before, and where the piles of surplus capital, of capital looking for new investments, are greater than ever before. Indeed, one way to understand the whole repertoire of radical vocabulary around neoliberalism, around biopiracy, shock doctrines, accumulation by dispossession, and all the rest, is simply to understand that the ferocity and the far-ranging scope of primitive accumulation in the neoliberal era has been largely unsuccessful at doing what all previous eras of capitalism have done. That is, fundamentally enact a new scientific technological revolution that would advance labor productivity. That has not occurred. So how was cheap nature restored? Well, in part by small frontiers, so we can think of places like West Africa or North Sea oil, and that kind of thing, but also by the sort of violent processes of redistributing wealth and power. And indeed, that was quite successful for a time, at least between 1983 and 2003. But what we're seeing today around the question of work and food, around this crucial food labor linkage, is the exhaustion of the capitalist agricultural model that began first in places like the maritime Low Countries and England in the 15th and 16th centuries. Indeed, agrobiotechnology represents a break with this long-standard model. There's been no great leap forward in system-wide agricultural productivity reckoned either in terms of labor or yield growth. It's failed to reverse the secular slowdown in productivity growth in agriculture. And perhaps more ominously and tellingly, agricultural productivity growth has slowed pace with labor productivity growth. Climate change is suppressing the possibilities of both of those dimensions of productivity growth in the present. So that's a really fundamental thing that's often left out. The problem is not the end of cheap energy or things like that, although that is a crucial issue, as I talk about in my books, but rather the ways in which climate is unsettling and in a fundamental way imploding the models that have been with us for 5 centuries. So what climate change gives us is a sense of the web of life producing, evolving, creating forms of nature that cannot be fixed in the old productivist scientific model. That they are forms of unruly and contentious natures that have themselves undergone a state shift, that is, abrupt and irreversible and increasingly resistive forms of nature that cannot be addressed readily within the capitalist model that has obtained for the past 5 centuries. So we see this in different registers. One of them that I've written a bit about is something called superweeds, where you see weeds that have evolved to withstand glyphosate poison. So that's an important vector of rising costs. With climate change itself, which is one of the greatest forms of what I'm calling negative value, these forms of nature that can't be readily fixed. Agriculture is going to bear as much as half to 2/3 by the conservative estimates of the OECD, by the way, of all global economic costs issuing from climate change. And that's a much more fundamental issue than if it were, say, cities or industry bearing 2/3 of the costs, which would be a grave situation in its own right. But it's not just forms of extra-human natures. We are also seeing the emergence of social movements of food sovereignty, food justice, climate justice at its best, movements to reclaim commons all around the world, including in the cities. These are all movements that I and others have called the new ontological politics. That is, especially in the form of food justice and food sovereignty, you see this very clearly, where the ontological politics of food says that the right to nutrition, the right to justice, the right to democracy are inextricable with each other. That is, this is not simply a question of more calories or golden rice so that people don't go blind from vitamin A deficiency. This is an issue of food as a whole product. And that is giving us, I think, some precious clues into the ways that work and life and this divide between production and reproduction, and food is, of course, at the center of this, will be reckoned with in the coming decades. So what's been hidden from view as we close is the dualism of what's been hidden from view by nature society. Dualism, the idea that we inhabit these different spheres, is a view of how capitalism works through the web of life, but also how the web of life now enters into a situation of profoundly limiting the conditions of capitalist business as usual in the present moment. And so what I want to end with is something that might be familiar to you, to those of you who are acquainted with Marx and ecology, which is his famous response to the Gotha program of the German socialists in the 1870s. And there he chides his comrades. He says, look, labor is not the source of all wealth, and nature is just as much a source of wealth as labor. But then the part that's often lopped off is that labor is only the manifestation of a force of nature. That work is itself a specifically harnessed natural force. A set of ideas, a claim that appears recurrently throughout Marx's thought that I think is very powerful, because for Marx, this connection of what he calls internal and external natures, of bodies and environments, of bodies and organizations making environments, environments making bodies and relationships, is so fundamental. And it seems to me that what we've seen over the past century, and I'm hopeful, and perhaps some of the colleagues who will be talking in just a moment can speak to this with greater specificity, and what we see with labor politics and with environmentalist politics is the creation of these sacred objects of labor, and of nature. That these are processes that Marx, in the Gotha program, Critique of the Gotha program, says that you've given supernatural powers to labor. That's what he says, supernatural powers to labor. But also, of course, environmentalists have given supernatural powers to the mythical category of nature. And so we have this kind of labor fundamentalism, nature fundamentalism playing into the mainstream jobs versus environment divide. And that's a problem. And how to cut through that analytically and more urgently or equally urgently politically is really at the heart of, I think, climate justice. That we need to reckon that work is always mobilized in and through the web of life, and that the web of life works too. Consider just for instance, the central role of non-human animals in human history, including today. I mean, think about the 12 billion chickens alive at this moment, but not for much longer. So this, and these chicken bones will be deposited very much in our geological layer, so it all comes full circle. So when we utter the phrase labor and nature, we should be clear that we are speaking of a diverse and dialectical unity. Rather than labor and nature, maybe we should remind ourselves that we are always talking about labor in nature, nature in labor. And that's a meaningful shift in how we think about these problems. It's not merely a question of words. And I think it's crucial to asking whether or not we are in a developmental crisis that will be resolved through new rounds of marketization and neoliberal restructuring, or if we're in a much more fundamental crisis, one that resembles the crisis of medieval Europe in the 14th century, when there was a profound climate crisis and that destabilized feudalism in such a way that business as usual was no longer possible. What happened? Well, the feudal elites said, guess what? We're going to go back to the old serfdom where you really have to work even more and do with even less. Sound familiar to those in the labor movement? Well, and what happened was the feudal ruling classes said, guess what? You're going back. And workers and peasants said, not so fast. We're not going back. And the revolts started much larger. They were much larger regional and urban revolts than had ever been seen before. So we need to start reckoning with these questions, I think, in much more, I mean, a little bit of philosophy goes a long way, but we need to be kind of a little bit philosophical about all this to see the deeper connections, I think. That here are the conclusions that I would make here, that in an era of climate crisis, that emancipatory politics has to stop drawing lines around whose work and whose lives matter and whose does not. The specifications of the contradictions of capitalism in the climate moment flow through this unity in diversity, that the worker is not only waged, but unwaged. It cuts across the production and reproduction divide. The worker is not only human, but also in some ways extra-human. That a move beyond nature-society dualism to think relationally can help us see the strategic contradictions and crises of the how of climate crisis as a geohistorical event. We know that climate change is bad news. It is in the how that politics unfolds, and so we need an analytic that takes that seriously. We need to insist no politics of nature without work, and no politics of work without nature. And finally, we need to recognize that the question of the politics of life and work can no longer be enclosed within the mythical category of society. To quote Thomas Munzer from the German Peasant War of 1525, the creatures too must become free. Thank you.